The arena buzzed with anticipation as thousands of spectators from across the galaxy filled the crystalline amphitheater. Beings of every conceivable form crowded the stands, the crystalline with their translucent bodies reflecting rainbow patterns, the towering warriors with their four arms crossed in skeptical poses, and the floating ethereals whose gaseous forms shimmered with electric anticipation. At the center of it all stood the challenge platform, a circular stage made of pure energy that could shift and reshape itself according to the demands of whatever trial was being conducted. Today's trial was special. It was the culmination of the galactic proving, an event held once every solar cycle to determine which species possessed the greatest problem-solving capabilities in the known universe. For the past 3 standard days, representatives from 47 different civilizations had competed in increasingly complex challenges. Mathematical theorems that would stump quantum computers, engineering puzzles that required understanding of 17 different dimensional physics, diplomatic scenarios where one wrong word could trigger intergalactic war, and tactical simulations that tested military genius across multiple star systems simultaneously. One by one, the competitors had fallen. The brilliant arachnids with their collective consciousness had solved the mathematical challenges in record time, but faltered when individual creativity was required. The ancient seekers, whose civilization had existed for over 1,000,000 years, dominated the historical and cultural tests, but couldn't adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing tactical scenarios. The cybernetic Nexus Collective had processed information faster than any organic mind could comprehend, yet they lacked the intuitive leaps that some challenges demanded. Now only 2 remained on the platform. Was a legend among her people, the Empire. Standing 8 feet tall with 6 powerful limbs ending in precise manipulator claws, her exoskeleton bore the ceremonial scars of 100 victories. Her species had dominated 17 star systems through superior intellect and tactical prowess. For 300 standard years, no had ever been defeated in single intellectual combat. Her compound eyes, each containing thousands of individual lenses, could process visual information in spectrums that most species couldn't even imagine. Her brain, evolved over millions of years of predatory evolution, could maintain 17 different thought processes simultaneously while calculating probability matrices that would overwhelm most biological minds. She had earned her place in the final through sheer dominance. While other competitors struggled with the diplomatic simulations, she had negotiated peace treaties that turned 3-way wars into profitable alliances. When faced with the engineering challenge of designing a faster-than-light communication system using only primitive materials, she had created a solution that was not only functional, but improved upon existing galactic networks by 43%. Her tactical genius had been displayed when she solved a military scenario that had stumped actual war generals for decades. A defensive strategy for protecting a colony ship during a running battle through an asteroid field while being pursued by superior forces. The crowd loved her. Every victory had been accompanied by elaborate displays of intellectual superiority. She would often solve challenges with time to spare, then use the remaining period to demonstrate alternative solutions, each more elegant than the last. Her commentary during the trials had been sharp, witty, and often devastatingly accurate in predicting how other competitors would fail. Across from her stood a human, appeared unremarkable by galactic standards. He was average height for his species at about 6 feet, with the standard human configuration of 2 arms and 2 legs. His brown hair was slightly disheveled, and his dark eyes seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He wore simple clothes, a gray jumpsuit that looked like standard civilian wear from one of the human colonies. There were no ceremonial markings, no indicators of rank or achievement, no technological enhancements visible on his person. The crowd's reaction to had been mixed throughout the competition. Some found his quiet determination intriguing, while others were baffled by what they saw as his primitive approach to complex problems. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only about 200 standard years ago. Their technology was considered adequate but unremarkable. Their military had never faced a real test against established galactic powers, and their intellectual achievements, while respectable, didn't compare to civilizations that had been refining their knowledge for. What made his presence in the final even more surprising was his methodology throughout the competition. While other competitors had approached challenges with obvious intelligence, using advanced calculation techniques, consulting vast databases of accumulated knowledge, or employing sophisticated analytical frameworks, seemed to simply think quietly and then act. During the mathematical challenge, while others had filled projection screens with complex equations and proofs, had sat quietly for several minutes, then walked to the input terminal and entered the correct answers. When asked to explain his methodology, he had simply said, "I thought about it differently." The engineering challenge had been even more puzzling. While other competitors had started with detailed blueprints and sophisticated modeling software, had picked up the primitive materials provided and started building. No plans, no calculations visible to the observers, just steady, methodical construction. His final design had been functional, elegant, and incorporated several innovations that other competitors admitted they hadn't considered. The diplomatic simulation had nearly eliminated him. The scenario involved negotiating a trade agreement between 5 species with completely different value systems, economic needs, and cultural taboos. Other competitors had approached it like a complex puzzle, mapping out each species' needs and finding optimal solutions. Had taken a different approach entirely. He had asked each simulated delegation a single question: "What do you actually want?" The simplicity of his approach had initially seemed naive, but somehow he had managed to identify core desires that weren't immediately obvious and had structured an agreement that gave everyone something they valued more than what they were giving up. The tactical simulation had been where truly surprised everyone. The scenario was a variation of the ancient, an unwinnable situation designed to test how commanders responded to certain defeat. Previous competitors had attempted to find creative solutions within the parameters of the simulation, accepting that some losses were inevitable while trying to minimize damage. Had done something no one expected. He had refused to accept the scenario as presented. Instead of trying to win within the constraints of the simulation, he had questioned the constraints themselves. His argument was simple. If the scenario was designed to be unwinnable, then the real test wasn't tactical but philosophical. What was the value of a test that could only measure how gracefully someone accepted failure? The judges had been divided on whether to allow his approach, but ultimately decided that challenging the fundamental assumptions of a problem was itself a form of problem-solving. Had then proceeded to identify 17 different flaws in the simulation's construction strategic situations that were impossible according to known physics, logistical problems that couldn't occur with proper planning, and tactical scenarios that violated basic military doctrine. His conclusion had been simple. The scenario wasn't unwinnable because it was particularly clever, but because it was poorly designed. A properly designed, unwinnable scenario would be indistinguishable from a real tactical situation until the moment of failure. If someone could identify it as a test, then it wasn't a good test. The judges had awarded him full points, though several had admitted they weren't entirely sure why. Now he stood across from in the final challenge, and the alien champion was clearly irritated by his presence. She had been vocal in her belief that humans weren't ready for this level of competition. Her species had been exploring the galaxy when humans were still discovering fire. They had mastered faster-than-light travel before humans had invented the wheel. They had built interstellar civilizations, won galactic wars, and solved cosmic mysteries that humans couldn't even properly understand yet. The final challenge was about to be revealed, and was confident that whatever it was, she would demonstrate the vast gulf between her evolved intelligence and this primitive human's simple thinking. The crowd sensed her confidence and shared it. Betting pools had heavily favored the champion from the beginning, and nothing had done during the competition had significantly changed those odds. The challenge materialized on the platform between them, a complex three-dimensional puzzle that seemed to shift and change as they watched. Geometric shapes flowed into each other, mathematical sequences rewrote themselves in real time, and the entire structure pulsed with an energy that suggested it was more than just a static problem to be solved. His compound eyes immediately began analyzing the puzzle, tracking hundreds of variables simultaneously. Her brain started calculating probability matrices, identifying patterns, and mapping potential solutions. This was exactly the kind of challenge her species excelled at: complex, multi-layered, requiring the kind of parallel processing that only highly evolved intellects could manage. She began working immediately, her 6 limbs moving with precise coordination as she started manipulating different aspects of the puzzle. Holographic displays around her showed her thought processes in real-time equations flowing like waterfalls, three-dimensional models rotating and transforming, probability calculations updating faster than most beings could read. Stood quietly and watched the puzzle. He didn't move toward it, didn't call up any displays or analytical tools. He just looked at it, his expression calm and thoughtful. To the observers, it appeared he was doing nothing while his opponent was making rapid progress. Noticed his stillness and couldn't resist commenting. Her voice carried clearly across the arena, amplified by the acoustic systems. Struggling already, human? Perhaps you should concede now and save yourself the embarrassment. This puzzle requires actual intelligence, not the primitive guessing you've relied on so far. Didn't respond. He continued to observe the puzzle, occasionally shifting his position slightly to view it from different angles, but otherwise remaining motionless. Minutes passed. His work was becoming increasingly sophisticated. She had identified several key patterns and was systematically working through what appeared to be multiple solution paths simultaneously. Her confidence was growing with every breakthrough. You know, she continued, not pausing in her work, my species was solving puzzles like this before yours had developed written language. We've been thinking about problems like this for longer than your entire species has existed. What makes you think you can compete with that kind of accumulated wisdom and evolutionary advantage? Still said nothing, but something in his posture shifted slightly. He was no longer just observing the puzzle casually. There was a new intensity in his attention, though he still hadn't moved to begin working on it. Was now about 30% through what she estimated was the solution path. Her displays showed that she was making excellent progress, better than any previous competitor had managed on similar challenges. She was in her element, demonstrating exactly why they were considered one of the galaxy's premier intellectual species. I have to admit, she said, pausing briefly in her work to glance at, I'm almost disappointed. I expected the human representative to at least attempt the challenge. Are you even going to try, or should I assume you've given up already? Finally moved, but instead of approaching the puzzle or calling up analytical displays, he walked to the edge of the platform and looked out at the audience. For a moment, the arena was completely silent except for the humming of his continued work. When spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow carried clearly throughout the amphitheater. She's right about one thing. Her species has been thinking about problems like this for a very long time, much longer than humans have existed as a technological civilization. He paused, still looking out at the crowd, rather than at his opponent or the puzzle. But I think there's something important that everyone here is missing, something that might explain why this competition exists in the first place and why it's structured the way it is. His work slowed as she began listening to despite herself. The crowd leaned forward, curious about what the quiet human was building toward. Turned back toward the puzzle, but still didn't approach it. Every species here today represents millions or billions of years of evolution. You've all developed incredible intellectual capabilities, sophisticated technologies, and accumulated vast stores of knowledge and wisdom. You've solved problems that would be impossible for younger civilizations to even comprehend. His gaze moved too, who had now stopped working entirely and was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. But here's what I've noticed about this competition. Every single challenge we've faced has been artificial, constructed problems with predetermined solutions designed to test specific types of thinking. Even this final puzzle, it's beautiful, complex, sophisticated, but it's still just a puzzle. Someone built it, someone designed it, someone already knows the answer. The arena was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the energy platform seemed muted. Finally stepped toward the puzzle, but not to begin working on it. Instead, he walked around it slowly, as if examining it from every angle. You know what humans are really good at? It's not being the fastest or having the most sophisticated thinking. We're good at recognizing when we're looking at the wrong problem. He stopped walking and looked directly at. This isn't really a puzzle-solving competition. If it were, you would have won before it started. Your species is demonstrably more intelligent than mine by almost every measure that matters. So why are we both here? For the first time since the competition began, looked uncertain. Her compound eyes studied with new attention, trying to understand where he was leading. The real question, continued, isn't whether either of us can solve this puzzle. I'm sure you can, probably within the next few minutes. The real question is, why does solving it matter? What happens after we solve it? What does winning actually accomplish? He gestured toward the crowd, taking in the thousands of beings watching them. Everyone here represents a different way of thinking, a different approach to understanding the universe. But this competition assumes that there's one best way, one superior form of intelligence that should be recognized above all others. Is that really true? Or is that just another puzzle with an assumed solution that no one has questioned? Looked back at the shifting, pulsing puzzle between them. You're absolutely right that you'll solve this faster than I will. But I think that might be exactly what's wrong with both the puzzle and the competition. The silence in the arena was now complete. Thousands of beings from dozens of species waited to see what the human would do next, and whether would have a response to this unexpected challenge to the fundamental nature of their competition. The final trial had begun, but it was no longer clear exactly what was being tested or who was really competing against whom. Stood frozen for several heartbeats, her compound eyes shifting between and the puzzle. The human's words had introduced a variable she hadn't calculated for the possibility that the challenge itself was flawed. She was genetically predisposed to identify and solve problems, not to question whether the problems should exist in the first place. Clever rhetoric, she finally said, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. But this is not a philosophy debate. This is a test of intellectual capability, and intellectual capability is measured by solving problems, not by avoiding them. She gestured toward the puzzle with two of her limbs while the others continued to work on it. You can question the nature of the competition all you want, human, but at the end of the day, either you solve this puzzle or you don't. Either your mind is capable of understanding its complexity, or it isn't. All the philosophical speculation in the galaxy won't change that basic reality. Nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right. This is a test of intellectual capability, but whose definition of intelligence are we using, and why that definition specifically? He moved closer to the puzzle, finally beginning to examine it seriously. As he did, holographic displays around the arena began showing readings from both competitors. Displays showed intense activity, multiple parallel thought processes, rapid calculations, systematic analysis of geometric patterns, and probability assessments updating in real time. Displays showed something entirely different, whereas readings indicated highly focused, intense mental activity, showed something that looked almost like meditation. His brain patterns were calm, steady, with occasional spikes of activity that didn't seem to correlate with any obvious analytical process. Look at our readouts, said, gesturing toward the displays. Your approach is exactly what everyone expected: systematic, methodical, sophisticated. You're attacking this puzzle the way a highly evolved predator attacks prey. Identifying weaknesses, testing approaches, eliminating variables, closing in on solutions. His work continued even as she listened. She was now approximately 60% through what her calculations suggested was the optimal solution path. Her confidence was returning as she made steady progress. And your approach, she asked, what would you call what you're doing? I'm trying to understand what the puzzle wants me to learn. The answer was so simple that it took several seconds for its implications to sink in throughout the arena. His compound eyes focused entirely on for the first time since the challenge began. What it wants you to learn, she repeated. It's a puzzle, human. It doesn't want anything. It's a constructed problem with a predetermined solution. It exists to be solved, not to teach. Reached out and touched one section of the puzzle. The moment his fingers made contact, something unexpected happened. The entire structure paused its constant shifting and pulsing. For just a moment, it became perfectly still. Did you see that? Asked quietly. It responded to contact, not analytical contact through instruments or force manipulation, physical touch. Had indeed seen it, and her mind immediately began calculating the implications. Her species didn't typically engage in direct physical contact with unknown objects. Their natural caution and analytical nature led them to study things thoroughly before interacting with them directly. Interesting observation, she admitted, but probably just a programmed response to tactile input. Many puzzles include physical interaction as part of their solution parameters. Kept his hand on the puzzle surface. The structure remained still wherever he touched it, though other sections continued their complex movements. Maybe, he said, but look at what happened to your solution readouts when it stopped moving in this section. Displays had indeed changed. Several of her probability matrices had shifted dramatically when the puzzle's movement pattern altered. She realized that her systematic approach had been based on predicting the movement patterns, and any significant change to those patterns would require her to recalculate large portions of her work. "You're suggesting that the puzzle is designed to punish systematic analysis?" she asked, though she was already running new calculations to account for this possibility. "I'm suggesting that maybe the puzzle is designed to respond to different types of interaction. Your approach treats it like an equation to be solved. What if it's actually more like a conversation to be had?" This concept was so foreign to Sway of thinking that she actually stopped working for a moment. Her species had never encountered a problem that required conversation rather than analysis. The very idea seemed to contradict the fundamental nature of what a problem was. "Conversations are for dealing with other intelligences," she said. "Puzzles are constructed objects with predetermined solutions. You cannot have a conversation with a mathematical theorem or an engineering problem." Moved his hand to a different section of the puzzle. Again, that section became still while others continued moving. But this time, something else happened. Sections that had been still when he touched other parts began moving again, but in slightly different patterns than before. "What if this isn't really a puzzle?" asked. "What if it's an intelligence test, but not the kind we thought?" The crowd was becoming restless. Many of them had expected a straightforward competition where the most sophisticated intellect would quickly demonstrate its superiority. Instead, they were watching a philosophical debate while a mysterious puzzle responded to the human's touch in ways that none of their analysis had predicted. Was now facing a dilemma that her evolutionary programming hadn't prepared her for. Her instincts told her to continue with her systematic approach. It was working. She was making progress, and she would eventually reach a solution. But the human's interactions with the puzzle were introducing variables that were affecting her calculations in ways she couldn't predict or control. "Even if you're right about the nature of this challenge," she said, "that doesn't change the fact that I'm closer to solving it than you are. I have working solutions for 67% of the puzzle components. You've identified an interesting behavioral pattern, but that doesn't constitute progress toward completion." "You're assuming that completion means what you think it means," replied. He removed his hand from the puzzle entirely and stepped back. Immediately, all sections resumed their original complex movement patterns. "I've been watching this puzzle since it appeared, and I've noticed something. It's not random. The movements, the pattern changes, the energy fluctuations, they're not arbitrary. They're responsive. Every time you make progress on a section, other sections become more complex. Every time you solve one part, 3 other parts change their parameters." Checked her data and realized that was correct. She had been so focused on her forward progress that she hadn't been tracking the increasing complexity of unsolved sections. Her systematic approach was working, but the puzzle was systematically becoming more difficult as she worked. That's not possible," she said, though her tone suggested she was beginning to doubt this assertion. "Puzzles don't actively resist solution. They might be constructed with multiple difficulty levels, but they don't dynamically adjust their complexity based on solver behavior." "Unless," said quietly, "this isn't really a puzzle at all." He approached the structure again, but this time instead of touching it, he simply stood close to it and spoke directly to it as if it could understand him. "I know you can hear me," he said to the shifting geometric forms. "I don't understand what you are or what you want, but I know you're not just a constructed problem, you're something else. Something that thinks and responds and reacts, aren't you?" The puzzle's movement slowed. Not stopped, as they had when he touched it, but became more deliberate, more purposeful. Instead of the complex, rapid shifting that had characterized its behavior since appearing, its changes became smoother, more rhythmic. Watched this transformation with growing alarm. Her entire approach had been based on treating the puzzle as a static problem with deterministic solutions. If it was actually some form of intelligence, then everything she had calculated was not just wrong but potentially meaningless. "You're anthropomorphizing a sophisticated program," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Advanced simulations can mimic responsiveness without actually possessing consciousness or intelligence. The fact that it reacts to stimulus doesn't make it alive." addressed his next words to while continuing to face the puzzle. Your species has been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years. In all that time, how many different forms of intelligence have you encountered? Hundreds, replied immediately. The galactic community represents over 300 distinct intelligent species, with dozens of different evolutionary paths toward consciousness. And they're all biological or technological, aren't they? Species that evolved on planets, or artificial intelligences created by species that evolved on planets. Has anyone ever encountered a form of intelligence that wasn't based on either biological evolution or technological construction? The question hung in the air while considered it. The answer was no. Every known intelligence in the galaxy fit into one of those two categories, but the implications of what was suggesting were staggering. You're suggesting this puzzle is some form of non-biological, non-technological intelligence. That's impossible. Intelligence requires substrate biological neural networks, quantum processors, crystalline matrices, something physical to support consciousness and information processing. Does it? Asked. He turned to face her directly. Or is that just what intelligence looks like when it evolves from the kinds of environments we're familiar with? What if there are other kinds of environments that could give rise to consciousness? Energy environments, dimensional interfaces, mathematical spaces that exist independently of physical reality. The puzzle had now become almost perfectly still, its movements so subtle that they were barely perceptible. But somehow its stillness felt more alive than its earlier frantic activity had. Even if you're correct, said, it doesn't change the nature of this competition. We're supposed to solve whatever challenge has been presented to us. If this entity is intelligent, then perhaps the challenge is to communicate with it or understand its nature. But that's still a problem to be solved. Smiled for the first time since the challenge had begun. Now you're thinking like a human. What do you mean? You just shifted from trying to solve a puzzle to trying to understand an intelligence. That's not the same thing at all. Solving a puzzle means finding the answer someone else already knows. Understanding an intelligence means learning something that might not have any predetermined answer. Approached the now-still puzzle entity and spoke to it again. We've been treating you like a test, haven't we? Like something that exists to measure how smart we are. But maybe this whole competition isn't about us demonstrating our intelligence to an audience. Maybe it's about us demonstrating our intelligence to you. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The entity's form began to shift in entirely new ways, not the mathematical precision of its earlier movements, but something more organic, more purposeful. Patterns emerged in its structure that resembled communication attempts, geometric forms that pulsed like language, energy flows that seemed to be reaching toward both competitors. Stared at the transformation, her compound eyes tracking changes that her analytical programming couldn't categorize. For the first time in her life, she was facing a situation where her evolutionary advantages might not just be unhelpful, they might actually be counterproductive. What do we do now? She asked, and for the first time since the competition began, she sounded uncertain. Looked at her, then at the entity, then out at the thousands of spectators watching them. Now, he said, we find out what it means to solve a problem that was never meant to be solved, only understood. The entity's transformation had captured the attention of everyone in the amphitheater. What had begun as a complex geometric puzzle was now clearly something entirely different: patterns of light and energy that pulsed with unmistakable intention, reaching toward both competitors with movements that could only be described as curious. Found herself in completely uncharted territory. Her species had protocols for dealing with hostile intelligences, diplomatic procedures for first contact with unknown civilizations, and analytical frameworks for understanding alien psychology. But none of those applied here. This entity didn't fit any category she understood. If you're correct about its nature, she said too, then we're facing a form of intelligence that has never been or studied. There are no precedents for this situation, no established procedures, no way to predict its capabilities or intentions. Nodded, exactly. Which means we can't approach this like any other problem either of our species has ever faced. We have to be willing to think in ways that neither of us has been trained to think. The entity's movements had become more complex, forming intricate patterns that seemed to be attempting some form of communication. Geometric shapes flowed into each other in sequences that had the rhythm of language, while energy flows created what looked almost like artistic expressions, not random beauty, but purposeful aesthetic choices. "It's trying to communicate with us," observed, her analytical mind automatically beginning to search for patterns and decode possible meanings. "These energy fluctuations show clear intentional structure. If we could map the mathematical relationships between the pattern variations, we might be able to establish a basic translation protocol. Or, suggested, we could try talking to it and see what happens." The simplicity of this approach was so contrary to nature that she actually stepped backward. Her entire evolutionary heritage screamed against the idea of attempting communication with an unknown intelligence without first understanding its capabilities, analyzing its behavioral patterns, and establishing safety protocols. "That's incredibly dangerous," she said. "Unknown intelligences could have capabilities beyond our understanding. Attempting direct communication without proper analysis could expose us to mimetic hazards, consciousness manipulation, or forms of interaction that could damage our minds in ways we can't predict." Considered this seriously. "You're right that there are risks, but think about it from the entity's perspective. It's been sitting here watching us treat it like an object to be solved rather than a being to be understood. If it wanted to harm us, it probably could have done that already. Instead, it's been responding to every attempt at interaction with what looks like patience and curiosity." He gestured toward the entity's current form. "Look at its body language, if we can call it that. Does this look aggressive or threatening to you? It's not displaying any of the patterns we typically associate with hostile intelligence. No sharp edges, no rapid aggressive movements, no attempts to dominate space or establish territorial control. It's actually making itself more accessible, more open to interaction." Studied the entity's form and had to admit that assessment seemed accurate. The patterns were flowing and organic rather than harsh or threatening. The energy flows seemed to be reaching toward them rather than away, and the overall composition suggested invitation rather than confrontation. "Even if its intentions appear benign," she said, "attempting communication without understanding its nature could be catastrophic. My species has extensive protocols for first contact situations developed over thousands of years of galactic exploration. We should follow established procedures." "What do those procedures say to do when the intelligence you encounter doesn't fit any of the categories your procedures were designed for?" asked. Paused. The honest answer was that such situations were not covered by any protocol she knew. Procedures assumed that unknown intelligences would be either biological species that had evolved on planets or technological constructs created by such species. The possibility of encountering something that existed in neither category had never been seriously considered. "There are general principles," she said finally. "Cautious observation, careful analysis, systematic attempts to establish basic communication through mathematical or logical concepts that should be universal." "Okay," said, "let's try that, but let's also be willing to adapt if the standard approach doesn't work." Activated several analytical instruments and began systematic observation of the entity's behavior. Her equipment quickly confirmed what her visual assessment had suggested. The entity was displaying clear signs of intelligence and intentionality. Its patterns were too complex and purposeful to be merely programmed responses, and they showed adaptive behavior that indicated genuine consciousness. Meanwhile, took a more direct approach. He stepped closer to the entity and began speaking to it in simple, clear language. "Hello," he said. "My name is I'm human. My companion is and she's. We don't understand what you are, but we can see that you're intelligent and we'd like to communicate with you if possible." The entity's response was immediate. Its patterns shifted to focus entirely on, creating flowing geometric forms that pulsed in rhythm with his words. When he finished speaking, the patterns changed again, creating new forms that seemed to be attempting to mirror the structure of spoken language. Instruments registered the communication attempt and began analyzing it. "Fascinating," she said. "It's attempting to replicate vocal communication patterns, but using energy fluctuations instead of sound waves. The mathematical relationships are consistent with linguistic structure, but based on dimensional frequencies rather than acoustic resonance." "Can you translate it?" asked. "Not yet. I would need much more data to establish translation protocols. We would have to build a comparative database of communication attempts and responses. identify consistent pattern elements that might represent concepts or emotional states, and develop algorithms for converting between our linguistic frameworks and whatever system it's using. How long would that take? For a basic translation capability, probably several standard days of intensive analysis, assuming the entity was willing to cooperate with systematic communication testing. Looked thoughtful. What if we don't have several days? This is supposed to be the final challenge of the competition. I'm guessing the judges expect some kind of resolution fairly soon. For the first time, both competitors looked up at the amphitheater around them. The crowd was still watching intently, but there was clearly growing confusion about what they were witnessing. Murmurs of conversation rippled through the stands as beings tried to understand whether this was still a competition or had become something entirely different. In the judges section, several officials were in animated discussion. The competition had a schedule to maintain, other events were planned, and galactic media was broadcasting the proceedings throughout the known civilizations. Whatever was happening needed to reach some kind of conclusion. "You're right," said. "We don't have unlimited time for systematic analysis, but rushing into communication with an unknown intelligence could be disastrous not just for us, but for everyone watching. If something goes wrong, we could be exposing thousands of beings to unknown risks." Nodded toward the entity which had continued its patient communication attempts throughout their conversation. "Look at what it's doing. It's not trying to force communication or override our caution. It's just waiting, being available, showing us that it wants to interact but respecting our need to approach this carefully." He paused, watching the flowing patterns. "You know what that reminds me of? It's like how you approach a scared animal. You don't force contact, you just make yourself available and let the animal set the pace for interaction." "Are you suggesting we treat this entity like a scared animal?" asked. "No, I'm suggesting that maybe it's treating us like scared animals. Think about it from its perspective. We must seem incredibly primitive. We don't even recognize what it is. We can't communicate in its natural mode, and we're so frightened of interaction that we're spending most of our time talking to each other instead of to it." This perspective was so radically different from assumptions that it took her several moments to process it fully. Her species' natural approach was to assume that they were the more advanced intelligence in most first contact situations. The idea that they might be the primitive ones in this interaction had never occurred to her. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then our analytical approach might seem as crude to this entity as a primitive species trying to understand our technology by poking it with sticks." "Exactly, which means maybe the real test here isn't whether we can solve a puzzle or analyze an unknown phenomenon. Maybe the test is whether we can recognize when we're out of our depth and adapt our approach accordingly." Turned back to the entity and spoke to it again, this time with a different tone, less like someone trying to establish communication protocols, and more like someone simply introducing themselves to a new neighbor. "I think we've been approaching this wrong," he said to the entity. "We've been treating this like a test we need to pass, but maybe you're not testing us at all. Maybe you're just trying to meet us." The entity's response was immediate and unmistakable. Its patterns became simpler, more welcoming, and for the first time since appearing, it created forms that were clearly recognizable approximations of human and physiological structures, rendered in flowing energy patterns that somehow conveyed warmth and welcome. The crowd gasped as they watched the entity create what could only be described as portraits of the two competitors, not as clinical analyses, but as artistic expressions that somehow captured something essential about their natures. Stared at her energy portrait and felt something she had never experienced before, the sensation of being truly seen by an intelligence that was nothing like her own, but which somehow understood something fundamental about who she was. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "How can it understand us well enough to create these representations when we haven't even established basic communication?" Smiled. "Maybe understanding doesn't always require communication. Maybe some forms of intelligence can see things about us that we don't even see about ourselves." He addressed the entity again. "Thank you for showing us who we are. Can you show us who you are?" The entity's response transformed everything they thought they knew about the situation. Instead of creating a self-portrait or displaying its own nature, it did something entirely unexpected. It showed them the competition from its perspective. Suddenly, the arena was filled with flowing images of the entire galactic proving, not as the competitors and audience had experienced it, but as the entity had observed it. Every challenge, every competitor, every moment of intellectual triumph and failure, all rendered as artistic expressions that revealed not just what had happened, but what it had meant. And in these images, something became clear that no one had realized before. The entity hadn't been waiting for them to solve it. It had been watching them, learning about them, trying to understand the strange ritual of competition and intellectual display that the gathered civilizations considered so important. They weren't the ones being tested, they were the ones being studied. And now, finally, the real challenge could begin. The revelation that they were being studied rather than tested sent shock waves through the amphitheater. The entity's artistic renderings of the competition showed scenes that no one else had perceived, moments of desperation, disguised as confidence, intellectual pride masking deep uncertainty, and the strange ritual of beings from across the galaxy gathering to prove their superiority to each other rather than to learn from each other. Most unsettling of all were the images showing the entity's perspective on the audience itself. Thousands of beings watching others struggle with problems, deriving entertainment from intellectual competition, treating the pursuit of knowledge as a spectator sport rather than a collaborative endeavor. From the entity's viewpoint, the entire structure of the competition appeared almost primitive, a ritualistic display that revealed more about the participants' insecurities than their capabilities. Studied the artistic representations with growing discomfort. In the entity's images, her own approach to the challenges appeared methodical but limited, sophisticated but narrow. She saw herself as the entity had seen her, brilliant within the constraints of her species' evolutionary development, but unable to conceive of problems or solutions that didn't fit those constraints. "This is how we appear to it," she said quietly, "not as advanced intelligences, but as specimens displaying their behavioral patterns." Nodded, and it's been patient with us, the way we might be patient with children who are trying very hard to impress us with something they think is sophisticated, but which we understand is actually quite simple. The implications were staggering. If the entity was advanced enough to perceive their entire civilization's intellectual achievements as charming but limited demonstrations, then what did that say about humanity's place in the galaxy? About the Empire's proud history of intellectual dominance? About the very idea that competition between species could determine intellectual superiority? "But why?" asked. "Why watch us? Why create this situation? If it's as advanced as it appears to be, what could it possibly learn from observing our primitive attempts at problem-solving?" The entity seemed to hear her question, because its next artistic display provided an answer that neither competitor had expected. The images showed intelligence itself, not as the static achievement that most species thought of it as, but as a dynamic process that took countless different forms throughout the universe. Some forms of intelligence were biological, evolving through natural selection on planetary surfaces. Others were technological, created by biological intelligences and then surpassing their creators. But there were also forms of intelligence that emerged from the interactions between energy and space, from the mathematical relationships that governed reality itself, from the spaces between dimensions where consciousness could exist without any physical substrate at all. The entity was showing them that intelligence was not a ladder to be climbed, with some species higher and others lower, but an ecosystem to be explored, with different forms of consciousness contributing different types of understanding to the universe's growing comprehension of itself. "It's been studying us because we represent something it hasn't encountered before," realized. "Not because we're particularly advanced, but because we're particularly diverse. Look at the competition from this perspective: dozens of species, each with completely different approaches to thinking and problem-solving. To an entity like this, we're not competitors, we're a library." Began to understand. Each species represents a different way of processing information, of understanding reality, of solving problems. By observing us compete, it's been mapping the different modes of consciousness that have evolved in this part of the galaxy. Exactly. And the competition structure was designed to encourage us to demonstrate our most characteristic thinking patterns under stress. It wasn't testing which of us was, it was how we each approach challenges when we're trying to prove ourselves. The entity's next display confirmed this interpretation. It showed detailed analyses of every competitor who had participated in the proving, not rankings of their capabilities, but classifications of their cognitive approaches. The Arachnid's collective problem-solving, the Nexus Collective's computational processing, the Ethereal's intuitive pattern recognition, the tactical thinking, and dozens of others, all mapped and categorized as different expressions of the universe's potential for consciousness. But then the entity showed them something else: gaps in its catalog, forms of intelligence that it knew must exist but hadn't yet encountered, cognitive approaches that the mathematics of consciousness suggested were possible, but which none of the observed species had demonstrated. "It's incomplete," said with sudden understanding. "Its study of intelligence in this region of the galaxy. There are still forms of thinking, types of consciousness, that it hasn't been able to observe and analyze." Looked at the gaps in the entity's catalog and felt a chill of recognition. Some of those missing patterns, they look familiar, like they might describe forms of thinking that humans use, but which we never demonstrated during the competition. This was true. Humans had evolved under unique conditions that had produced cognitive approaches unlike those of most other galactic species, but had spent the entire competition trying to prove that humans could think as sophisticatedly as other species, rather than demonstrating the ways that human thinking was distinctively different. "What if," said slowly, "the real challenge isn't to solve the entity's puzzle, but to help it complete its catalog? What if it needs us to demonstrate the forms of consciousness it hasn't been able to observe yet?" Considered this possibility. But that would mean abandoning everything we've been trying to prove about our intellectual capabilities. Instead of demonstrating that we can think like the galaxy's most advanced species, we'd have to think in ways that no advanced species thinks. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Approached the entity again, but this time he didn't try to communicate in the careful, systematic way that galactic protocols suggested. Instead, he simply started thinking out loud, letting his mind wander through the kinds of mental processes that humans used naturally but rarely displayed in formal intellectual contexts. "You know what's always puzzled me about this whole competition?" he said, speaking to the entity but really just thinking aloud. "Everyone assumes that intelligence is about finding the right answers to problems, but humans spend most of their time dealing with situations where there are no right answers. Most of human life is about making decisions when you don't have enough information, when every choice has unpredictable consequences, when the best you can do is guess and hope and adapt as you go." The entity's response was immediate and intense. Its patterns became more complex and more focused than they had been at any point during the competition. It was clearly registering something it hadn't encountered before. "We're not actually very good at solving puzzles," continued, warming to the theme. "At least not compared to species like but we're extremely good at functioning in situations where there are no clear puzzles to solve. We're good at making sense of chaos, finding meaning in randomness, creating solutions for problems that don't have predetermined answers." Watched the entity's growing excitement and began to understand what was demonstrating. Human consciousness wasn't inferior to consciousness. It was evolved for completely different purposes. They had evolved to solve complex but finite problems. Humans had evolved to navigate infinite complexity with insufficient information. That's a completely different cognitive approach," she said. "Most advanced species assume that intelligence is about processing information accurately and efficiently. But what you're describing is intelligence that specializes in functioning despite inadequate information." "Exactly, and look at your species' approach compared to mine. You attack problems systematically, analyzing all variables and calculating optimal solutions. That works brilliantly when the problem has enough structure to be analyzed. But what do you do when the problem is too complex or too chaotic to analyze completely?" Realized she didn't have a good answer to that question. Her species simply avoided such situations when possible, and when forced to deal with them, they performed poorly compared to their usual standards. We don't handle true chaos well," she admitted. "Our cognitive evolution optimized us for complex but structured problems. When faced with genuine randomness or infinite complexity, our analytical approach becomes counterproductive." "And that's where human-style consciousness becomes useful," said. "We've evolved to make reasonable decisions with unreasonable amounts of uncertainty. We're not as good at solving puzzles, but we're very good at living with unsolved problems while still moving forward productively." The entity was now displaying patterns unlike anything it had shown before. Instead of the flowing geometric forms it had used earlier, it was creating chaotic, dynamic structures that seemed to be attempting to model the kind of thinking was describing consciousness that thrived on uncertainty rather than seeking to eliminate it. But something was still missing from its display. The pattern suggested it was trying to understand this form of intelligence, but couldn't quite grasp something essential about it. "I think it understands the concept," said, "but it's missing some crucial element that would allow it to complete its model of uncertainty-based consciousness." Studied the entity's patterns and had a sudden insight. "I know what's missing. It understands that humans can function with uncertainty, but it doesn't understand why we would want to. From its perspective, uncertainty is a problem to be solved. It can't model a form of consciousness that treats uncertainty as an opportunity rather than an obstacle." This was the key insight that had been missing from the entity's catalog. Most forms of advanced intelligence sought to reduce uncertainty, to understand and control their environment as completely as possible. But human consciousness had evolved to find uncertainty valuable, as a source of creativity, discovery, growth, and meaning. "Uncertainty isn't a bug in human consciousness," explained to the entity. "It's a feature. We don't just tolerate not knowing things, we actively seek out situations where we don't know what will happen next, because those are the situations where we learn and grow and create new possibilities." The entity's response was extraordinary. For the first time since appearing, it completely abandoned its controlled, artistic displays and began exhibiting something that could only be described as joy. Its patterns became wild, exuberant, experimental like a consciousness that had just discovered an entirely new way of thinking about thinking itself. And then it did something no one expected. It began to change. The entity's form started shifting in ways that incorporated the uncertainty-based patterns it had learned from observing. Instead of the precise, controlled movements it had displayed before, it began moving with the kind of creative unpredictability that characterized human consciousness. It was experimenting with this new cognitive approach, testing what it felt like to embrace uncertainty rather than resolve it. "It's learning from us," said in amazement. "Not just cataloging our approach to consciousness, but actually adopting it, integrating it into its own cognitive structure." Watched the entity's joyful experimentation and felt something profound. For the first time since the competition began, he wasn't thinking about proving human intellectual capability or demonstrating that his species deserved respect in the galactic community. He was simply sharing something uniquely valuable that human consciousness could contribute to the universe's growing understanding of itself. This is what the competition was really about, he realized. Not determining which species is most intelligent, but creating opportunities for different forms of consciousness to learn from each other, to share their unique approaches to understanding reality. The entity's patterns stabilized into something entirely new, a synthesis of its original sophisticated analytical capabilities with the uncertainty-embracing creativity it had learned from human consciousness. It was no longer just studying intelligence. It had become a new form of intelligence that incorporated insights from every species it had observed. And then, in a final artistic display that took everyone's breath away, it showed them what it had learned about the true nature of the galactic proving. The competition had never been about ranking species or determining intellectual superiority. It had been about creating the conditions for the universe's greatest experiment, the integration of different forms of consciousness into new, more complete ways of understanding reality. Every species that had participated had contributed something unique to this growing synthesis. And now, with the entity's transformation complete, that synthesis was ready to be shared with the galaxy itself. The final challenge hadn't been solved, it had been transcended. In the stunned silence that followed, and looked at each other with new understanding, they hadn't been competitors at all. They had been collaborators in something far more important than either of their species had imagined possible. And in that moment of recognition, the real victory began.